so he covered everything I was going to say. But I'll do my best to keep you entertained. So, the way we have this conversation has been wrong. It's been extremely wrong. We have had a narrative of Remainers knew best. Remainers were the educated ones. It was wrong. Because the reason why I got involved in this at the beginning was because, having studied EU law, I saw that the Remain camp was dropping the ball. We had Cameron telling you time and time again, you need the single market or your economy will explode. And yet never once during the entire referendum told us what the single market was. You just heard it explained. And it could have been done in 20 seconds. You just need to say, the single market as a system lets you make a single version of your product and it will be legal across 28 different countries. That means you can sell your products cheaper, that means your prices will be cheaper, and that benefits society. That's all you need to say. The terms harmonization to make your laws the same, or mutual recognition whereby as long as your product meets the requirements of the UK, it's legal to sell in all 27 other countries, those concepts were never even mentioned. How can you have a debate, an informed decision as to whether or not to leave the single market when nobody knew what it was, Remainers and Leavers alike? If we pretend that we're smarter than them, if we pretend that we're more educated than them when we didn't know even that, this conversation will stay as fractious as it's always been. So how should we speak to people who voted for Brexit? We should say we want the same things, because we do. There was some exceptions. We all wanted a better NHS. We did, because the NHS is struggling. But if we were to point at a person that would be responsible for that, it wouldn't be Juncker, it would be Hunt. So we have to look at what Brexit would actually do to the NHS. The EU has 40 agencies that perform governmental tasks. For example, the Chemical Regulations Agency, the European Medicines Agency, which was in London, the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is in Vienna, which is where I was just working. These agencies perform governmental tasks. And right now, the bill for that is shared across 28 different countries. Brexit puts that all back on the UK taxpayer. So the idea that there would just be this bundle of cash waiting to put on the NHS, that's not happening. In fact, the NHS relies on, what does a national health service rely on? You'd say doctors, nurses, and treatments. EU doctors, and this is a point I made to Farage relatively recently, EU migrants make up 5% of our population and 10% of our doctors. So which means that rather than EU immigration being something that threatens people in this country, it's literally keeping us alive. And nursing applications have dropped significantly, and then there's treatments. As I said, the European Medicines Agency was in the UK. That was basically where new medicines get certified so that they can be sold. Any pharmaceutical company that wants to sell a new drug, wants to get a new drug and sell it across its consumers, would do so in the biggest market available. If we have to set up our own European Medicines Agency, our own UK Medicines Agency, and the UK and the EU has theirs, where are the new drugs going to go first? A market of 425 million people or a market of 65? So Brexit means a loss of doctors, nurses, and treatments. Then add that to Euratom, the ability to get radioactive materials, to get them across Europe, which is necessary for chemotherapy and radioactive treatments. Doctors, nurses, and treatments, the absolute bedrock of any health service, and Brexit damages all three of them, including funding. So yeah, it's not good for that. They wanted more sovereignty, and as Ian explained, resulting in less. We've been going around the country as our future, our choice. We ask people, how do you think it's going? They say, terrible. I say, what do you want? What did you want? They say, sovereignty. We wanted to be more in control of our own laws. That's a legitimate wish. Everyone in this country should want the UK to be as influential as possible. We are a great nation. But is Brexit achieving that? Theresa May says that for the first 2 years of Brexit, we're going to be following the rules of the EU, but no longer having a say in what those rules should be. That means we are definitely a less sovereign country for those 2 years. We're less sovereign than any country, well, arguably in the world, because our laws will literally be handed down to us. We'd have given up our seat at the table. And she says that after that, and I quote, the UK will have to make a firm commitment to make sure its regulatory standards stay as high as the EU's. That commitment in practice means that our regulatory standards will remain substantially similar in the future. That means copying EU law for the rest of time. How is that taking back control? So when I ask them, how do you feel about that? They say disgusting, as any logical, rational person would. So the idea that Brexit that is resulting in damage to the NHS, a less sovereign country, and every expert says will be economically worse off, calling that the will of the people when both Brexit voters and Remain voters aren't happy with it is backwards. So you point out to them that we wanted the same things, the government hasn't delivered. Because yes, we all know nobody likes to be told they're wrong. So make it simple. You voted for a Brexit that would make this country a bit richer, that would make the NHS better, that would make us more influential, and the government hasn't delivered. That's something anyone can get behind. Now, can I get the thing up?
Just need your passport.
Oh, sorry. There you go. Let's deal with one of the biggest myths in the entire debate. What would you say is one of the biggest accusations made against the EU? Hands up.
Bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic, undemocratic, yeah, there we go. So, let's have a look at what the EU actually is. Oh, yeah, it wasn't okay. Just looking that way. The EU is made of four, the EU decision making mainly takes place in four bodies. That is the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council, and the Council of Ministers. Yes, the Commission is the least democratic one of all of those. But let me explain. The European Parliament, okay. So, European Parliament, you vote for that in the European elections. Now, in the last European elections, how many of us do you think voted? What do you think the turnout was? 34%. So only 34% of us turned up to vote in the last European elections, and then 2 years later, we all voted to say that we didn't have a say in Europe. But every piece of legislation gets passed through the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. They're the ones who ultimately have a say in what becomes law in the European Union. And that means that, yes, the Commission may make proposals, but every single proposal the Commission makes gets sent to those two bodies, gets torn apart, amended, and they can either be approved or rejected. And I've said before, that means that even if the Commission was the soul of Hitler himself, it wouldn't make a difference because everything has to get completely changed by them. It gets rewritten by the co-legislators. The Council of Ministers is ministers, national ministers. So for example, if they're dealing with a health issue, it'll be health ministers from each country. So Jeremy Hunt will be our representative. So that is basically, for example, the Fisheries Committee, the Fisheries Council, when you hear about how we need to take back control of our fish, the fishing quotas that the EU has are basically calculated by sustainability experts, by environmental experts. They decide how much do we need what should the cap be so that we don't overfish and destroy and wipe out whole species, which would condemn fishing for the next generation. They then send that information to the Council of Ministers, and it is national ministers who then divvy it up amongst themselves. It's not some EU edict done by unelected bureaucrats. It is your national fishing ministers who decide what the fishing quotas should be to protect fishing industries across Europe. So, European Parliament elected directly by European elections, Council of Ministers, who are ministers who are elected nationally. European Council actually heads the government, so just, Theresa May, and so forth. Commission, which is basically one person put forward by each country, and then it needs to get chosen by each of the heads of state, and then approved by the European Parliament. People often say, I never voted for the commissioner, and which my response is, did you vote for Jeremy Hunt? Statistically. Pardon?
Someone did.
Someone did, yes. But 99.9% of the population did.
But you can get thrown out.
But yes, as can every commissioner. Gross misconduct gets any commissioner thrown out. It's in the treaties.
What about people in this country?
I think most people in this room, most people in this country, hate the guts of Jeremy Hunt, but we can't get rid of him. Because that is the essence of representative democracy and indirect democracy. We vote for politicians who then vote for people to be in position. I mean, right now, the situation in British democracy is that we have a minority government, i.e. a government that the majority of the electorate voted against, and they've chosen somebody who now has the power over your life and death. That's British democracy. That's representative indirect democracy. It is a fact of democracy. There's the argument, well, why is it the commission that proposes laws? They're not elected. Who actually writes the laws in any democracy? Is it the actual elected ministers, or is it the civil service that drafts it? Who elected them?
Parliament can.
But
The commission is the civil service.
The commission is the civil service. It's the civil service. Don't shout out, because other people have the same right as you do. The commission, you should equate to the civil service.
Right. You don't vote for the civil service.
You don't vote for the civil service.
But
Carry on, please.
Any active rights.
the vast majority of legislation isn't proposed by MPs in the
Yes,
UK.
but it can be.
It can be, yes, and the Parliament in the EU works with the Commission to work on.
Can the European Parliament propose legislation?
They can make what's it called? On initiative reports, which then trigger the creation of new legislation. So no, it's not the same system, but in practice, the amount of legislation created by MPs in the UK is minimal. So it's not a practical difference how democracy is made. Besides, in the end, it's the European Parliament that has the final say on everything.
How is it rejected?
The point is, if you don't like it, you've got more control by staying in and trying to reform it.
Oh, yeah, that worked well for Cameron, didn't it?
Look, that's the problem. David Cameron, if someone elected him, and the way
Right, we're going to have a question and answer session afterwards. So that's going to go on.
Okay. But you did bring up another point, reform. I have a funny clip which I regularly show, which is Nigel Farage saying, we've been trying to reform the EU for 40 years and we haven't been able to. And another clip of where he told me, yes, I've been in the EU for 18 years and I've never voted for a single piece of legislation. Yeah, he wasn't there.
Yeah.
So, the people telling you the EU can't be reformed don't show up to make positive differences. In fact, one of the issues that I really dislike about the EU, the fact that they have it in Strasbourg every month, that's something that Nigel Farage didn't vote to change. That was up for reform, and he didn't vote to change it. The idea that the EU hasn't been reforming means you haven't been paying attention. In 2008, we had the Lisbon Treaty. That completely reformed the EU, made it significantly more democratic, shifted power towards the directly elected MEPs. We had, in 2009, the creation of the Transparency Register. 2014 is the year where they made it so that every commissioner and every director general, if they meet with anybody, they have to record that meeting publicly. So there've been massive changes in transparency, led by British MEPs. Richard Corbett, absolute rock star in the EU. We are reforming the EU, but if you think that the way to reform the EU is by having your country vote to leave and then going there with a list of demands, by the way, that's when he did that, immigration, as was mentioned, that was a major issue. Under EU law, you cannot come here without a job unless you have sufficient resources not to become a burden on the social assistance system of this country and have comprehensive medical insurance. Which means that the myth that the EU forces us to let unlimited numbers of people come here, live off benefits and plug up the NHS, lie. If that's happening, which it isn't, it's because the UK government has chosen not to enforce those rules. Unlike countries like Belgium, Austria, who do so. I mean, I've lived in both of those countries, and I had to register within about a month and provide a copy of my employment contract, say how much I was earning, how long I was going to be there. The EU has rules for controlled immigration, but the UK government chose not to use those. So, if you're the EU and you see a prime minister who chose not to enforce your immigration rules come to you demanding increased control of immigration, what are you going to say? And then there was regarding immigration, there's also the Nigel Farage's breaking point policy. He stood in front of, in fact, it's one of the, I asked people, what are the two images you can think of most when you think back to the referendum campaigns? It would be either the bus or Nigel Farage with his bacon poster. That was, many of you will have in your mind saying, well, that was racist, wasn't it? But it's very hard to argue as to why it was racist. The reason why it's racist is because the UK has a complete opt-out on the common asylum policy, which means that not one refugee enters this country unless the UK says so. And yet, Nigel Farage managed to use that poster to convince millions of voters that the UK was forcing us to accept refugee quotas. Now, why is that racist? Because the only people who have a right to come here under the EU are EU citizens. So why not show Polish people? Why not show Bulgarians? Why choose the brown people? Why say that that's the thing you should be scared of? It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, but he knew that it would scare the specific people that he wanted to reach. That's why he did it. So, but it all comes down to control. The fact that they made us feel powerless. They made the electorate feel powerless. They told us that we didn't have a say in Europe, even though we chose not to use that say. They told us that that an EU army is coming. Firstly, no, possible defense cooperation, but not an EU army. And as for that, the treaties say that you have specific competences which require unanimity. Defense, foreign policy, tax, these are some of them. We have control over these issues. The core issues of a country's sovereignty, like defense. I mean, for example, and this is one of the reasons why I think the EU is so important, the EU acts as an external morality to us. I mean, the UK, I was working for an NGO in Brussels that was specializing in the human rights violations in the Gulf states. And I was finding out about Saudi Arabia and what they were doing in Yemen and how they've been bombing and killing 5,000 civilians, they were bombing hospitals and schools. And then I found out the country responsible was my own, well, one of them, because we've been selling them weapons. And then I found out that the EU was the one with a common position that said that this was in violation, in which this was a violation. And the EU has been trying to stop us doing that because that's why the EU has principles, like it has a written constitution, so you can't make any laws that are discriminatory, that violate people's rights. But here's the thing: even though we have that, on the other hand, we still have power because on defense, which weapons manufacture and sale comes under, the EU tried to stop us but couldn't because we have complete autonomy on that. So, but this was never talked about. The fact that the EU does provide a moral guide, but also never dictates to us on the issues that are core to sovereignty. Have I missed anything out? Are there any arguments that you regularly hear that you wish you had an answer to?
Too many. They tend to be small. They tend to be personal.
Shall we take some questions and answers then? No. We love you, but